The blood-soaked snow told a desperate tale as Zara Matthews fled through the winter night of 1875, her bare feet leaving crimson prints that vanished beneath the relentless snowfall. She couldn't feel her toes anymore, couldn't feel much of anything except the terror pushing her forward into the vast, unforgiving frontier of Dalhart, Texas. Mason Hawkins pulled his coat tighter as he guided his horse through the blizzard, squinting against the wall of white that had descended without warning. The cattle would have to fend for themselves tonight. If he didn't find shelter soon, he'd be just another frozen corpse come spring thaw. That's when he spotted them footprints, impossibly small and bare, disappearing into the darkness ahead. "What in God's name?" he muttered, urging his horse forward. No one in their right mind would be out in this storm, especially not barefoot. Yet there they were, tracks leading away from the main trail, veering toward the creek bed. Mason followed, his instincts as a tracker overriding his common sense. He found her collapsed beneath a snow-laden pine, curled into herself like a wounded animal. Her dress was torn and soaked through, her dark hair frozen in tendrils around her face. But it was her feet that caught his attention, bare, blue-tinged and bloodied. "Miss," Mason called, dismounting quickly. When she didn't respond, he knelt beside her, feeling for a pulse. It was there, faint but steady. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with pain. She jerked away from his touch, a primal fear evident in her expression. "Easy now," he soothed, keeping his distance. "I'm not going to hurt you. But you'll die out here if you don't let me help." "They'll find me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Who will?" But her eyes had closed again, her body surrendering to the cold. Mason didn't hesitate. He removed his heavy woolen coat and wrapped it around her slender frame before lifting her onto his horse. His cabin was less than a mile away. If they could make it there, she might have a chance. The storm intensified as they rode, ice crystals forming in Mason's beard and on his eyelashes. The woman in his arms was light, too light, and he could feel her shivering violently against him. He urged his horse faster, knowing each passing minute decreased her chances of survival. Finally, the outline of his cabin emerged through the snow. Mason had never been so relieved to see the modest structure he called home. He dismounted awkwardly, careful not to drop his fragile cargo, and kicked the door open with his boot. Inside, embers still glowed in the fireplace. Mason laid the woman on his bed, then hurried to stoke the fire back to life. As warmth gradually filled the small space, he turned his attention to his unexpected guest. Her feet were worse than he'd initially thought, the skin mottled white and blue, with patches of angry red where she'd scraped them raw on hidden rocks and ice. Frostbite had already set in. Mason filled a basin with lukewarm water and carefully placed her feet inside, knowing the pain would be excruciating once feeling returned. As if on cue, she gasped and tried to pull away as the water touched her skin. "I know it hurts," Mason said, holding her ankles firmly but gently. "But we've got to warm you slowly. Too fast could cause more damage." Her eyes, now fully open, regarded him with suspicion. They were an unusual shade amber with flecks of gold, and despite her condition, they burned with an intensity that caught him off guard. "Where am I?" she demanded, attempting to sit up before wincing and falling back onto the pillow. "My cabin, about 15 miles outside of Dalhart," Mason answered, continuing to bathe her feet. "I found you half frozen in the snow. What in heaven's name were you doing out there barefoot in a blizzard?" She looked away, her jaw tightening. "Running." "I gathered that much," Mason replied dryly. "The question is what from or who from?" "That's my business," she snapped, then immediately softened. "I'm sorry, you saved my life." "I shouldn't," she broke off with a cry as sensation began returning to her toes. Mason nodded, understanding her pain went beyond the physical. "We'll talk later. Right now, we need to get you warm and dry. I'm Mason Hawkins, by the way." "Zara," she offered after a long pause. "Zara Matthews." "Well, Miss Matthews, I've got some clothes you can change into. They'll be too big, but they're dry." He stood and moved to a trunk in the corner, pulling out a clean flannel shirt and a pair of trousers. I'll step outside while you change, then we need to see to those feet properly. Mason waited on the porch, the bitter cold a stark reminder of how close Zara had come to death. Who was she running from in weather that would keep even the most desperate outlaws indoors, and what had happened to her shoes? When he returned, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, drowning in his clothes, her wet dress hanging near the fire. Her feet remained in the basin, the water now tinged pink with blood. "May I?" Mason asked, kneeling before her with clean cloths and a jar of salve. Zara nodded, her expression guarded but resigned. As gently as possible, Mason dried her feet and applied the salve, a mixture of herbs and bear fat he'd learned to make from an old trapper. Zara bit her lip but made no sound as he worked, her hands gripping the edge of the bed until her knuckles turned white. "You've got cuts that need stitching," Mason informed her, examining a particularly deep gash on her right heel. "And I'm concerned about frostbite in your toes." "Will I lose them?" Zara asked bluntly. Mason met her eyes. "I don't know. I've seen men lose less damaged appendages and I've seen others make full recoveries. It depends on how quickly we can restore proper circulation and prevent infection." She nodded, accepting his honest assessment. "Then do what you must." Mason retrieved his medical supplies, rudimentary by any standard, but better than nothing. As a rancher living miles from the nearest doctor, he'd learned basic medical skills through necessity. He threaded a needle and steeled himself for the task ahead. "This will hurt," he warned her. "I'm familiar with pain, Mr. Hawkins," Zara replied, a bitter edge to her voice. As Mason worked, stitching the worst of her cuts and massaging feeling back into her toes, he couldn't help but notice other marks on her body, older bruises on her wrists. A healing cut above her eyebrow, partially hidden by her hair. Someone had hurt this woman, and recently. When he finished, Mason wrapped her feet in clean bandages. "You won't be walking for a while," he told her. "The good news is your toes are pinking up. I think we caught the frostbite in time." Relief flashed across Zara's face before she quickly masked it. "Thank you." Mason nodded and moved to the stove. "You must be hungry. I don't have much, but there's stew I can heat up." While the stew warmed, an awkward silence filled the cabin. Zara sat stiffly on the bed, clearly uncomfortable with her vulnerability, while Mason busied himself with unnecessary tasks to give her space. "How long have you lived out here?" she finally asked, her voice soft but steadier than before. 5 years, Mason answered, stirring the stew. "Bought this land after the war. Seemed like a good place to start over." "You fought with the Union," he confirmed. "Though out here, no one much cares which side you were on as long as you mind your own business and pay your debts." A ghost of a smile touched Zara's lips. "Is that why you're out here alone? To mind your own business?" "Partly," Mason admitted. "I've got a small herd of cattle, enough to make a living. It's quiet, peaceful most days. Until strange women show up half dead in snowstorms," Zara added, attempting humor though her eyes remained serious. Mason ladled stew into 2 bowls and brought one to her. "I've had worse interruptions." They ate in silence, Zara with surprising vigor for someone who'd been near death an hour earlier. When she finished, she set the empty bowl aside and looked at him directly for the first time. "I can't stay," she said firmly. "Once the storm passes, you can't even walk," Mason pointed out. "And the storm isn't likely to pass for at least 2 days, according to my knee." "Your knee," he shrugged. "Old war injury, acts up before storms, never been wrong yet." Zara's expression darkened. 2 days is too long, they'll come looking." "Who will come looking, Miss Matthews?" Mason asked quietly. "Those bruises on your wrists didn't come from your run through the snow." Her hand instinctively covered her wrist. "It's complicated." "I've got time," Mason replied, settling into his chair by the fire. "And like I said, the storm's not passing anytime soon." Zara stared into the flames for so long Mason thought she might not speak at all. When she finally did, her voice was hollow. "I was married," she began, 6 months ago to Walter Blackburn. He owns the Blackburn Mining Company in Dalhart. She paused, gauging Mason's reaction. Mason kept his expression neutral, though the name was familiar. Blackburn was one of the wealthiest men in the county, known for his ruthless business practices and political connections. He was charming at first, Zara continued. My father had died, leaving debts. Walter offered to pay them in exchange for my hand. It seemed reasonable at the time, she laughed bitterly. How naive I was. Once we were married, he changed. The first time he hit me, I told myself it was an accident. By the 10th time, I knew better. Mason's hands tightened on the arms of his chair, but he remained silent, letting her speak. Today, yesterday. I don't even know what day it is now, she said, shaking her head. He found letters from my cousin in Denver. I'd been writing to her, asking if I could come stay. He went into a rage like I've never seen. He locked me in the cellar. Her voice broke. Said he'd deal with me in the morning. I knew what that meant. So you escaped, Mason supplied. Zara nodded. There's a small window in the cellar. I managed to break it and squeeze through, but the glass cut my dress to ribbons. My shoes got caught as I was climbing out, and I couldn't go back for them. All I could think was to run, to get as far away as possible before he realized I was gone. 15 miles barefoot in a snowstorm, Mason said, respect evident in his tone. That takes courage, or desperation, Zara countered, but it won't matter if he finds me. He has friends in the sheriff's office. They'll be looking storm or no storm. Fear crept back into her voice. A wife is property in the eyes of the law, Mr. Hawkins. He can do whatever he wants to me, and no one will stop him. Mason stood and paced the small cabin, digesting her story. He'd heard rumors about Blackburn's temper, but nothing specific about abuse. Then again, such matters were often kept private, especially among the wealthy. He won't find you here, Mason decided aloud. Not in this weather, and by the time the storm passes, we'll have a plan. Zara looked up, surprise evident on her face. This isn't your problem, Mr. Hawkins. You've done more than enough already. Mason, he corrected. And I make it a point to finish what I start. I didn't pull you from that snow just to send you back to a man who beats you. Tears welled in Zara's eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. You don't understand the risk. Walter is powerful. He could have you arrested or worse. I've faced worse odds, Mason replied simply. Get some rest now. We'll talk more in the morning. As predicted, the storm raged through the night and into the next day. Zara slept fitfully, waking often with nightmares that left her gasping for breath. Mason gave her the bed, making himself a pallet near the fire where he dozed between checking on her and stoking the flames. By morning, Zara's feet had improved slightly, though they remained swollen and painful. Mason changed her bandages and applied more salve, noting with relief that her toes remained pink and warm. Can you feel this? He asked, gently pressing her smallest toe. Zara nodded. It hurts, but I can feel it. Good, that's a good sign. Outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming the landscape into an unrecognizable white expanse. Mason's small barn was nearly buried, though he'd managed to trudge out at dawn to check on his horse and the few cattle he kept close to the cabin during winter. I need to go into town, Mason announced after they'd shared a breakfast of cornbread and coffee. Zara's head snapped up. That's insane in this weather, and Dalhart is where Walter will be looking for me. Not Dalhart, Mason clarified. There's a smaller settlement about 5 miles east, just a trading post and a few cabins. I need supplies if we're going to be snowed in, and I need information. He pulled on his heavy coat. I won't be gone more than a few hours. Keep the fire going and stay off those feet. Before Zara could protest further, Mason was out the door, leaving her alone in the unfamiliar cabin. She sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind howl outside before curiosity got the better of her. Using the wooden chair as support, she hobbled around the small space, examining the few personal items Mason possessed. A worn Bible on the shelf. A daguerreotype of a young woman tucked inside it, a sweetheart, perhaps. A collection of books that surprised her with their variety. Thoreau, Hawthorne, even a volume of Tennyson's poetry. A handcrafted chest set with pieces carved from deer antler. Each discovery revealed a new facet of the quiet cowboy who had saved her life. By the time Mason returned, stomping snow from his boots at the door, Zara had managed to heat water for tea and was back on the bed, her feet elevated as he'd instructed. "You'll never guess what I heard," Mason said without preamble, shaking snow from his hat. "Walter Blackburn is offering a $100 reward for information on your whereabouts." Zara paled. "Did anyone at the settlement recognize you?" "No one who would connect me to you," Mason assured her. "Old Lester at the trading post minds his business." "But the news has spread even in this weather, which means Blackburn must be desperate to find you." "He hates losing what he considers his," Zara said bitterly, "and he's never handled humiliation well." Mason unpacked his saddlebags, revealing flour, coffee, sugar, and most surprising, a pair of women's boots. "These belong to Lester's wife," he explained, seeing Zara's questioning look. "She passed last winter. They might be a bit large, but they'll serve until we can get you proper footwear." "Thank you," Zara said softly, touched by his thoughtfulness, "but I can't repay you for all this." Mason waved away her concern. "Consider it an investment in doing what's right." He busied himself preparing a stew for their dinner while Zara watched, questions forming in her mind that she wasn't sure she should ask. Finally, curiosity won out. "The photograph in your Bible," she began hesitantly. "Is she your wife?" Mason's movements stilled for a moment before he resumed cutting potatoes. "Her name was Alina. We were engaged before the war." His voice was steady but held an undercurrent of old pain. "She died of typhoid while I was fighting. I didn't learn about it until I came home." "I'm sorry," Zara said, regretting her question. "I shouldn't have pried." "It was a long time ago," Mason replied, though his tone suggested the wound hadn't fully healed. "What about your family, besides the cousin in Denver?" "My mother died when I was 12, Zara explained. "My father raised me alone. He was a good man, but not good with money. When he died, the debts were substantial. Walter's offer seemed like salvation at the time." Mason nodded, understanding the impossible choice she'd faced. "And your cousin, would she take you in?" "I believe so," Zara said hopefully. "Elizabeth has always been kind, but Denver is over 300 miles from here. How would I ever make such a journey, especially now in winter?" "One problem at a time," Mason advised, adding meat to the pot. "First, your feet need to heal. Then we deal with Blackburn. After that, we can think about Denver." The way he said, "we" made Zara's heart flutter unexpectedly. It had been so long since anyone had been on her side, since anyone had cared what happened to her. She pushed the feeling away, reminding herself that Mason was simply being kind. Once she was healed, she would move on, and he would return to his solitary life. That night, as the wind howled outside, Mason taught Zara to play chess on his handmade set. She proved a quick learner, her strategic thinking impressing him. "Where did you learn to read Tennyson?" she asked during their second game. "Your books suggest a formal education." Mason smiled slightly. "My father was a schoolteacher in Pennsylvania. He believed education was more valuable than gold. I was studying law when the war broke out." "You gave up law for ranching?" Zara asked, surprised. "After what I saw in the war, I couldn't stomach the idea of more conflicts, more arguments," Mason explained, moving his knight. "Out here, things are simpler. Right and wrong are clearer." "Until a half-frozen woman complicates things," Zara said with a small smile. Mason looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the board. "Some complications are worth having." The moment hung between them, charged with something neither was ready to acknowledge. Zara looked away first, focusing intently on the chess pieces. "Check," she announced, moving her bishop. Mason laughed, breaking the tension. "You're a natural." 3 days passed in similar fashion, the storm finally abating on the fourth morning. Zara's feet were healing remarkably well. She could now stand and walk short distances, though Mason insisted she continue to rest them as much as possible. They fell into an easy routine, sharing meals and stories, playing chess in the evenings by lamplight. On the fifth day, Mason saddled his horse. "I need to check on the herd," he explained. "They've been fending for themselves during the storm. Some might have strayed or gotten trapped in snowdrifts." "I'll be fine," Zara assured him, seeing his hesitation. "I'll keep the door barred," Mason nodded, still uneasy. "I shouldn't be gone more than a few hours. If anyone comes, hide and stay silent," Zara finished for him. "I understand." After he left, Zara tried to distract herself by reading but found herself constantly glancing at the door. Despite the cozy cabin and her improving health, fear remained her constant companion. What if Walter had somehow tracked her here? What if he arrived while Mason was away? Her fears proved prophetic. Just after midday, the sound of approaching horses made her freeze. Peering cautiously through the window, she saw 3 riders approaching and recognized one immediately as Sheriff Dobbs, Walter's close friend and drinking companion. Heart pounding, Zara grabbed the boots Mason had given her and slipped them on, wincing at the pain. There was no time to leave a note. She slipped out the back door and limped toward the tree line as quickly as her injured feet would allow, praying the fresh snow wouldn't make her tracks too obvious. When Mason returned 2 hours later, he knew something was wrong before he even reached the cabin. The front door stood ajar and unfamiliar horse tracks circled the yard. Drawing his pistol, he approached cautiously, calling Zara's name. The cabin was empty but showed signs of having been searched. Drawers were pulled open, the bed linens disturbed. On the table lay a notice official-looking, with the sheriff's seal. "Be it known that Zara Blackburn, née Matthews, has fled her lawful husband and is to be returned to his custody immediately upon discovery. Any persons harboring said fugitive will face charges of kidnapping and theft of property." Mason crumpled the paper, fury building in his chest. Theft of property. As if Zara were no more than a horse or a cow to be claimed by her owner. He searched the cabin thoroughly, looking for any sign of where they might have taken her, when he noticed the back door was unlatched. Outside, partially obscured by the recent snowfall but still visible to his experienced eye, were small footprints leading away from the cabin toward the forest. Relief washed over him. She had escaped before they arrived. Mason followed the tracks, noting how they meandered and sometimes doubled back. Zara had been trying to cover her trail. Smart woman. The footprints led deep into the pine forest that bordered his property to the east, eventually reaching a fallen log where she appeared to have rested. From there, the trail continued, though her steps were becoming more irregular, suggesting her injured feet were giving her trouble. Finally, as dusk approached, Mason found her huddled in the hollow base of an enormous old oak tree, shivering violently, her face pale with exhaustion and cold. "Zara," he called softly, holstering his pistol and approaching slowly to avoid frightening her. She looked up, relief flooding her features. "Mason, they came, the sheriff and 2 deputies. I heard them talking about searching the property." "I know," Mason said, kneeling beside her. "They're gone now. Can you stand?" Zara tried to rise but collapsed with a cry of pain. Mason looked down and saw blood seeping through the borrowed boots. She had reopened her wounds during her desperate flight. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "All your work healing them and I've ruined it." "Don't apologize for surviving," Mason said firmly, lifting her into his arms. "We can't go back to the cabin tonight. They might return. There's a line shack about a mile from here that my hands use during calving season. We'll stay there until I figure out our next move." The line shack was little more than a one-room shelter with a small stove, a narrow cot, and basic supplies. Mason settled Zara on the cot before starting a fire in the stove. Outside, he covered his horse's tracks as best he could and led the animal into a small lean-to attached to the back of the shack. When he returned, Zara was attempting to remove her boots, her face contorted with pain. "Let me," Mason said, gently taking over the task. The boots were soaked with blood and snow, adhering to her bandages. As carefully as possible, he eased them off, revealing the damage beneath. The stitches he had placed so carefully had torn, and fresh cuts crisscrossed the partially healed ones. "We need to clean these again," he said, keeping his voice calm despite his concern. "The supplies are back at the cabin, but there should be some whiskey here that will help disinfect them." Mason found the bottle stashed in a cupboard and returned to Zara's side. "This will hurt," he warned. Zara nodded grimly. "I know." She bit her lip to keep from crying out as he poured whiskey over the open wounds, but couldn't prevent a few tears from escaping. Mason worked quickly, tearing strips from his own shirt to create fresh bandages. "The sheriff had a warrant," Zara said once he had finished. "They'll be watching your cabin. You should turn me in, Mason. I won't have you arrested because of me." "That's not happening," Mason said firmly. "What Blackburn is doing isn't right, warrant or no warrant." "But the law, some laws deserve to be broken," Mason interrupted. "I fought a war partly because some men believed they had the right to own other human beings. I won't stand by while your husband treats you like property." Zara stared at him, something shifting in her expression. "Why are you doing this? You barely know me." Mason sat back on his heels, considering her question. "Because it's right," he said simply. "And because I've spent 5 years out here avoiding entanglements, telling myself I was better off alone. Then you appeared and suddenly—" He trailed off, struggling to articulate the change in him. "And suddenly," Zara prompted softly. "Suddenly I remembered what it feels like to care about someone else's welfare more than my own," Mason finished, meeting her eyes. "I'm not saying this right. I don't expect anything from you, Zara. But I can't send you back to him. I won't." In the dim light of the shack, Zara's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Mason assured her. "Just rest. We'll figure out our next move in the morning." The cot was barely wide enough for one person, so Mason made a pallet on the floor beside it, insisting Zara take the more comfortable sleeping arrangement. Despite their precarious situation, she fell asleep quickly, exhaustion overcoming fear. Mason lay awake longer, listening to her even breathing and considering their options. The law was on Blackburn's side. A husband had near absolute authority over his wife. If they stayed in the territory, Zara would eventually be found and returned to her abuser. They needed to leave, to get her to her cousin in Denver or perhaps even further away. But traveling in winter with Zara's injured feet would be dangerous, and Mason couldn't abandon his ranch without preparation. He had cattle to consider, and leaving suddenly would mean financial ruin. Yet staying meant risking Zara's safety and his own freedom. By dawn, he had made his decision. Regardless of the cost to himself, he would see Zara safely away from Blackburn's reach. If that meant leaving everything he had built behind, so be it. Some things were worth the sacrifice. When Zara woke, Mason had already prepared a simple breakfast of coffee and hardtack from the shack's supplies. He outlined his plan as they ate. "We need to get you to Denver," he began. "The railroad from Dalhart is out of the question. Blackburn will have men watching the station. But there's another line that runs through a settlement about 40 miles west of here. We could make it in 2 days riding, 3 at most with your feet in their condition." "What about your ranch?" Zara asked, concerned. "You can't just leave everything." "I can and I will," Mason said firmly. "Your safety comes first. Once you're settled with your cousin, I can decide whether to return or start over elsewhere." Zara shook her head. "I can't ask you to give up your home for me." "You're not asking, I'm offering," Mason replied. Unless you'd rather make the journey alone." "I would understand if you preferred that." "No," Zara said quickly, surprising herself with her vehemence. "I mean, I'm grateful for your help. I just don't want to be the cause of you losing everything." Mason reached across the small table between them and took her hand. "Zara, I lost the things that mattered most to me long ago. This ranch, these cattle, they're just possessions. I've been existing out here, not living. If helping you means starting over, then perhaps it's exactly what I need." His words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to explore. Zara squeezed his hand, unable to articulate the emotions swirling through her. "Thank you," she said simply. They spent the day preparing for their journey. Mason returned briefly to his cabin to gather essential supplies, relieved to find it undisturbed since his last visit. He packed food, medicine, extra clothing, and all the cash he had saved, nearly $300, kept in a lockbox beneath a floorboard. When he returned to the line shack, he found Zara standing outside, testing her weight on her injured feet. The borrowed boots had been stuffed with rags to keep them from rubbing against her wounds. "How do they feel?" Mason asked, dismounting. "Painful," Zara admitted, "but I can walk." "I won't slow us down. You'll ride," Mason insisted. "At least until we're sure we're not being followed. I can walk alongside." Zara looked like she might argue but nodded instead, recognizing the practicality of his suggestion. "When do we leave?" "First light tomorrow," Mason decided. "We'll stick to the forests and ridgelines where we can, avoiding the main trails. It will make the journey longer but safer." That night, as they prepared for sleep, the cramped confines of the line shack seemed suddenly intimate in a way it hadn't before. Mason busied himself checking their supplies while Zara sat on the cot, combing her fingers through her long hair, working out the tangles. "I've been thinking," she said hesitantly, "about what happens after Denver." Mason paused, his back to her. "What about it?" "You said you might not return here, that you might start over elsewhere." Zara took a deep breath. "I don't want to presume anything, but I also don't want to simply disappear from your life after everything you've done for me." Mason turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "What are you saying, Zara?" "I'm saying." She faltered, then straightened her shoulders. "I'm saying that in the short time I've known you, you've shown me more kindness and respect than Walter did in 6 months of marriage. You've risked everything to help me, a stranger, and I find myself caring for you in a way I didn't think possible again." Mason crossed the small room in 2 strides and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Zara, you've been through a terrible ordeal. You're vulnerable right now. I would never take advantage of that." "That's exactly why I'm saying this," Zara insisted. "Because you wouldn't. Because you see me as a person, not a possession. Because when you look at me, I feel like myself again, not Walter's frightened wife." She squeezed his hands. "I'm not asking for promises or declarations. I'm just asking that when we reach Denver, we don't say goodbye forever." Mason's eyes, usually so guarded, softened as he gazed at her. "I think I've been half in love with you since I found you in that snowdrift," he admitted quietly, "but I need you to be sure. I need you to have time to heal, to find yourself again before we decide anything." Zara nodded, emotion tightening her throat. "Time then, but not goodbye." "Not goodbye," Mason agreed, raising her hand to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Now get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." They set out before dawn, Mason having decided that traveling in the pre-dawn darkness would provide additional cover. He helped Zara mount his horse, securing their supplies behind the saddle, then led the animal on foot through the silent, snow-covered forest. For 2 days, they traveled westward, keeping to the ridges and forests as planned. Mason proved to be an expert woodsman, navigating without trails and erasing their tracks when they crossed open ground. They saw no sign of pursuit, but remained vigilant, stopping only when necessary and avoiding any sign of human habitation. On the 3rd day, as they crested a hill, the small settlement of Hartsville came into view in the valley below. Unlike Dalhart, it was little more than a collection of buildings clustered around a railway stop, but to the weary travelers, it represented hope. "The train to Denver comes through every Tuesday and Friday," Mason explained as they observed from their vantage point. "Today's Thursday, so we have a day to prepare." They made camp in a sheltered ravine about a mile from town, Mason constructing a lean-to of pine branches to protect them from the wind. As night fell, they sat close together before a small, carefully banked fire, sharing the last of their jerky and hardtack. "I need to go into town tomorrow," Mason said, adding a branch to the flames. "We need tickets, and I should see if there's any news about Blackburn's search." Zara nodded, though anxiety was evident in her expression. Be careful, Walter has connections. He might have spread word even this far. I'll be discreet, Mason promised. How are your feet? Better, Zara said, extending them toward the fire. I can walk without much pain now. Your herbal salve worked wonders. Mason smiled, pleased with her progress. Good, the less attention we draw on the train, the better. They sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Zara spoke, her voice soft against the night sounds. Tell me about your life before the war, she requested. What kind of law did you want to practice? Mason leaned back, surprised by the question but willing to answer. I was interested in property law, actually. My father had lost a parcel of land in a dispute when I was young. The paperwork was in order, but the other party had better lawyers. I wanted to prevent that happening to others. You would have made a good lawyer, Zara observed. You have a strong sense of justice. Mason chuckled. Perhaps, but the war changed everything. After Gettysburg, after seeing so many men die over principles and property lines, legal arguments seemed trivial. And Alina, Zara asked gently, was she supportive of your ambitions? A distant look entered Mason's eyes. Yes. She was the daughter of another teacher, brilliant in her own right. We had plans to open a school together once I was established in my practice. He sighed. Dreams of youth. I'm sorry, Zara said, placing her hand on his arm, for bringing up painful memories. Mason covered her hand with his own. Don't be. It was a long time ago. What about you? What dreams did you have before circumstances intervened? Zara's smile was tinged with nostalgia. I wanted to be a writer. I kept journals, wrote stories. My father encouraged it, though he warned me it wasn't a practical aspiration for a woman. She laughed softly. He suggested I marry a printer so at least I'd be close to books. And instead you married a mine owner, Mason observed. Yes, Zara acknowledged, her smile fading. Walter burned my journals when we married, said they were childish fancies, that I needed to focus on being a proper wife. Mason's hand tightened on hers. When we reach Denver, you should write again. Perhaps I will, Zara mused. A story about a woman who runs through the snow without shoes, and the cowboy who saves her. Their eyes met across the fire, and something shifted between them, a recognition, an acknowledgement of feelings growing deeper by the day. Mason leaned forward slowly, giving Zara every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. Instead, she met him halfway, their lips touching in a kiss that was gentle yet full of promise. When they separated, Mason rested his forehead against hers. I told myself I wouldn't do that until you were safe, he murmured. I feel safe with you, Zara whispered back. Safer than I've felt in years. Morning brought clear skies and renewed determination. Mason left for town at first light, promising to return by noon. Zara waited anxiously in their makeshift camp, alternating between hope and fear as the hours passed. When Mason finally returned, his expression was grim. What's wrong? Zara asked immediately, rising to meet him. Did someone recognize you? No, Mason said, dismounting. But I saw this. He handed her a newspaper, the Dalhart Daily Chronicle. On the front page was an article that made Zara's blood run cold. Search continues for missing wife of prominent businessman Walter Blackburn, offers increased reward for information leading to the return of his wife, Zara, who disappeared during last week's blizzard. Blackburn fears his wife, described as mentally unstable, may have become disoriented in the storm and perished. The sheriff's office has expanded their search to neighboring counties. Mentally unstable, Zara repeated, her voice shaking with anger. Of course. That's how he'll explain any accusations I make against him. There's more, Mason said grimly. Blackburn himself is in Hartsville. I saw him at the hotel near the station, talking with the local constable. They're showing your photograph to everyone in town. Zara sank down onto a fallen log, the newspaper crumpling in her hands. Then we can't take the train. He'll be watching. Not necessarily, Mason said, sitting beside her. I have an idea, but you might not like it. At this point, I'm open to anything, Zara said, looking up at him with renewed determination. Disguise, Mason suggested. Cut your hair, dress as a young man. Blackburn is looking for a woman with long, dark hair. A youth traveling with his older brother wouldn't draw a second glance. Zara touched her hair reflexively. It fell past her waist, a feature Walter had particularly admired and forbidden her to cut. The thought of defying that prohibition, even now, gave her a thrill of rebellious satisfaction. Do it, she decided. Cut it all off if necessary. Mason produced a pair of scissors he'd purchased in town, along with men's clothing that might fit Zara's slender frame. As the late afternoon sun filtered through the pine branches, he carefully cut away her long tresses, both of them silent as the dark locks fell to the ground. When he finished, Zara ran a hand through her newly shortened hair, which now barely reached her ears. The sensation was strange but liberating, as if she'd shed more than just hair. She'd cut away another tether to her past life. "How do I look?" she asked, turning to Mason. His expression softened as he studied her. "Beautiful," he said honestly. "Different, but still beautiful." Zara blushed, then laughed at herself. After everything they'd been through, a simple compliment could still make her cheeks warm. Will it be convincing enough? "With the clothes and a bit of dirt smudged on your face, I think so," Mason assured her. "The key is confidence. Walk like you belong, speak little, and follow my lead." They spent the evening rehearsing their story. They were brothers, Matthew and Zachary Holt, traveling to Denver to meet their uncle who owned a printing business. Mason coached Zara on how to deepen her voice slightly and adopt the mannerisms of a young man. As they prepared to sleep, their last night before reaching the relative safety of the train, Zara found herself reluctant to close her eyes. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, but also the promise of freedom. And after Denver. That future remained unwritten, though the possibilities filled her with both excitement and trepidation. "Mason," she said softly, lying beside him under their shared blankets. "If something happens tomorrow, if we're separated, I want you to know how grateful I am. For everything." Mason turned to face her, his eyes serious in the dying firelight. "Nothing will happen. We'll make it, Zara." "But if it does," she insisted. "I need you to know that meeting you has changed me. You've reminded me of who I was before Walter, of who I can be again." Mason reached out, tracing the line of her newly shortened hair. "You were always that person, Zara. You just needed to remember her." He hesitated, then added, "Whatever happens tomorrow, know this, I will find you. If we're separated, if something goes wrong, I won't stop looking until I do." The intensity in his voice made Zara's heart race. She leaned forward and kissed him, trying to convey everything she couldn't yet say aloud: her fears, her hopes, her growing feelings for this quiet, honorable man who had risked everything for her. When they parted, no more words were needed. They held each other close as the fire died down and sleep finally claimed them. Morning brought a light snowfall that Mason declared perfect for their purposes. It would provide additional cover as they approached the town. Zara dressed in the boy's clothing, binding her chest with strips of cloth and practicing her deeper voice. Mason showed her how to walk with a longer stride and less sway to her hips. "Remember, you're my younger brother," he reminded her as they prepared to leave their camp. "Stay close, speak little, and let me handle any questions." The walk into Hartsville seemed interminable, each step bringing them closer to either freedom or discovery. Zara's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone they passed must hear it, but the few people out in the early morning paid them little attention. Mason led them directly to the train station, a simple wooden structure with a single platform. A small crowd had already gathered, waiting for the Denver train scheduled to arrive in 30 minutes. Zara kept her head down, cap pulled low over her shortened hair as Mason purchased their tickets. "2 for Denver," he told the clerk, sliding money across the counter. The bored-looking man barely glanced at them as he handed over the tickets. "Track 1. Trains running on time for once." Mason nodded his thanks and guided Zara to a bench at the far end of the platform, positioning himself between her and the rest of the waiting passengers. So far, so good. No sign of Blackburn or his men. Their luck didn't hold. Just as the train whistle sounded in the distance, announcing its approach, Walter Blackburn himself emerged from the station house, accompanied by two rough-looking men. They began moving systematically through the crowd, Blackburn scanning faces while his companions questioned passengers. Zara froze, her blood turning to ice. Even at this distance, she could see the cold determination on her husband's face. Mason squeezed her hand in reassurance, though his own body had tensed. "Don't look at them," he murmured. "Keep your head down and follow my lead." The train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and billowing steam, providing a momentary distraction. Passengers began to disembark while others moved forward, ready to board. Mason timed their movement perfectly, guiding Zara into the flow of people heading for the train just as Blackburn's attention was diverted by a new arrival on the platform. They were steps from the nearest car when a voice called out behind them. "Hawkins! Mason Hawkins!" Mason turned, placing himself protectively in front of Zara. Sheriff Dobbs was pushing through the crowd toward them, hand on his pistol. "Get on the train," Mason told Zara urgently. "Now." "Not without you," she insisted. "Go," Mason repeated. "I'll be right behind you." Before she could protest further, Mason gently but firmly pushed her toward the train steps. A conductor was calling all aboard. As Zara reluctantly climbed into the car, looking back in time to see Mason facing the approaching sheriff. "That's him." Blackburn's voice cut through the noise. "And the boy with him must be Zara in disguise." Panic surged through Zara. Blackburn had recognized her despite the disguise. She reached the top step just as the train began to move, watching helplessly as Sheriff Dobbs reached Mason. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Mason said something to the sheriff, his expression calm despite the hand hovering over Dobbs's gun. Then, with a sudden motion, Mason shoved the sheriff backward into Blackburn and his men, creating a moment of confusion. In that instant, Mason turned and ran for the moving train. Zara reached out her hand, leaning dangerously far from the steps. Behind Mason, Blackburn had recovered and was drawing a pistol. "Mason!" Zara screamed as the train gathered speed. Mason sprinted alongside, his fingers brushing Zara's outstretched hand twice before finally grasping it firmly. With a mighty effort, Zara and a nearby passenger pulled him aboard just as a shot rang out, the bullet splintering wood where Mason had been moments before. They collapsed onto the floor of the train vestibule, breathing hard. Through the window, Zara could see Blackburn's furious face receding as the train picked up speed, taking them beyond his reach at last. "You could have been killed," Zara gasped, clutching Mason's coat. "Worth the risk," Mason replied, his breathing ragged but his eyes bright with triumph. He cupped her face in his hands. "We made it, Zara. We're free." The conductor appeared, frowning at them sprawled on the floor. "Tickets, please, and I'll thank you not to cause any more disturbances on my train." Mason helped Zara to her feet, both of them struggling to compose themselves as he handed over their tickets. The conductor examined them, glanced suspiciously between Mason and Zara in her boyish disguise, then shrugged. "Car 3 has available seats," he informed them before moving on. They made their way through the swaying train to the designated car, finding 2 seats near the back. Only when they were settled did Zara allow herself to truly believe they had escaped. Tears of relief threatened, but she held them back, mindful of her disguise. "What did you say to the sheriff?" She asked quietly once they were alone. Mason's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "I told him I had evidence that Blackburn was abusing you and that the real crime was forcing you back to such a man." And he hesitated, Zara realized. "That gave you the chance to run." "Dobbs may be Blackburn's friend, but he's not a completely corrupt man," Mason observed. "Sometimes the truth, plainly spoken, can create just enough doubt to make a difference." The train journey to Denver took 2 days, during which Zara maintained her disguise as Mason's younger brother. They spoke little to other passengers, keeping to themselves and remaining vigilant. At night, they took turns sleeping, one always on watch despite their exhaustion. As the landscape changed outside their window, mountains rising in the distance, Zara felt hope growing stronger within her. Denver represented not just safety, but a new beginning, a chance to reclaim the life and dreams that had been taken from her. On the afternoon of the second day, the train pulled into Denver's Union Station. The bustling metropolis was unlike anything Zara had experienced, with its broad streets, brick buildings, and diverse population. Still in her disguise, she stayed close to Mason as they navigated the crowded station. "You know where your cousin lives?" Mason asked as they emerged onto the street. Zara nodded. "Elizabeth married a doctor. They have a house on Lincoln Street, according to her letters." They hired a hack to take them to the address, both tense with anticipation and lingering fear. What if Elizabeth refused to take them in? What if Blackburn had somehow telegraphed ahead? Their worries proved unfounded. Elizabeth Marshall, a tall, handsome woman in her 30s, took one look at Zara in her boyish clothes and ushered them both inside without hesitation. "My dear girl, what on earth has happened to you?" she exclaimed once they were safely behind closed doors. "Your hair and these clothes?" Her gaze shifted to Mason, suddenly suspicious. "Who is this man?" "This is Mason Hawkins," Zara explained quickly. "He saved my life, Elizabeth, in every possible way." Over cups of hot tea in Elizabeth's comfortable parlor, Zara recounted the events of the past weeks, her escape from Walter, running barefoot through the snow, Mason finding her and healing her frostbitten feet, their narrow escape from Hartsville. Elizabeth listened in horrified silence, occasionally glancing at Mason with increasing respect. "I always knew Walter Blackburn was cold," she said when Zara finished. "But this is monstrous." She reached across to squeeze Zara's hand. "Of course you can stay here as long as you need." "Both of you," she added, nodding to Mason. "I don't want to impose," Mason began, but Elizabeth waved away his objection. "Nonsense. You saved my cousin's life and brought her safely to me. The least I can offer is hospitality." Elizabeth's husband, Dr. James Marshall, proved equally welcoming when he returned home that evening. After hearing their story, he insisted on examining Zara's feet, pronouncing Mason's treatment surprisingly competent for a cowboy. "They'll heal completely," he assured Zara. "Though you may always have some sensitivity to cold in those toes." That night, in the guest bedroom Elizabeth had prepared for her, Zara finally allowed herself to fully process everything that had happened. She was safe. Walter couldn't reach her here, hundreds of miles from Texas. She had allies now: Elizabeth, Dr. Marshall, and most importantly, Mason. A soft knock on her door roused her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Mason standing there, hesitant. "I wanted to check on you," he said. "Make sure you're settling in all right." Zara smiled, opening the door wider in invitation. "Come in. Everything's wonderful. I can't remember the last time I slept in a proper bed with clean sheets." Mason entered but remained standing near the door, maintaining a respectful distance. "Dr. Marshall seems confident your feet will heal completely." "Thanks to you," Zara said softly. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken questions about the future. Finally, Mason cleared his throat. "I'll be leaving tomorrow," he announced, his voice carefully neutral. Zara's heart plummeted. "Leaving? To go where?" "Back to Texas, at least temporarily," Mason explained. "I need to settle my affairs there, sell the cattle, maybe the land too. I can't leave everything unresolved." "Of course," Zara said, trying to mask her disappointment. "That makes sense." Mason took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "I'm coming back, Zara, if you want me to." Relief washed over her. "I do," she said simply, "very much." Another step closer. "We said we'd give you time to heal, to find yourself again. I meant that." "I know," Zara acknowledged. "And I appreciate it, but Mason." She closed the distance between them, placing her hands on his chest. "I've spent 6 months being told who I was, what I wanted, how I should feel. I know my own mind now. I know my own heart." Mason's arms encircled her, drawing her closer. "And what does your heart tell you?" That life is uncertain and precious, Zara answered. That when you find someone who sees you, truly sees you, you don't let them go. She looked up at him, no longer hiding the depth of her feelings. It tells me I'm falling in love with you, Mason Hawkins. The smile that transformed Mason's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. I'm already in love with you, Zara Matthews, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Have been since I found you in that snowdrift, though I tried to deny it. Their kiss was different from the tentative ones they had shared before, deeper, certain, full of promise. When they finally parted, both were breathless. I'll come back to you, Mason vowed, resting his forehead against hers. 2 weeks, 3 at most, just long enough to settle things in Texas. I'll be waiting, Zara promised. And working on that story about the woman who ran through the snow without shoes and the cowboy who found her. Mason left the next morning on the first train south, carrying Zara's heart with him. Elizabeth, observing their farewell at the station, smiled knowingly but said nothing until they were back in her carriage. He's a good man, she remarked casually. The best I've ever known, Zara agreed. And you love him. It wasn't a question, but Zara answered anyway. Yes. Is it that obvious? Elizabeth laughed. My dear, the way you two look at each other could melt all the snow in Colorado. Her expression grew serious. But what about Walter? He's still legally your husband. The question sobered Zara immediately. In the rush of escape and newfound love, she had pushed aside the reality of her marital status. Under the law, she was still Mrs. Walter Blackburn, and any relationship with Mason could be considered adultery. I don't know, she admitted. Divorce is nearly impossible to obtain, especially for a woman. And even if I could, Walter would never agree to it. Perhaps not, Elizabeth mused. But James has connections in the legal community here. It might be worth exploring your options. Over the next 2 weeks, while waiting for Mason's return, Zara did exactly that. With Elizabeth's introduction, she met with a sympathetic lawyer who outlined her limited choices. Abandonment is your best argument, Mr. Daniels advised. If your husband doesn't contest it, which seems unlikely given his actions thus far, you could potentially secure a divorce after a period of separation. How long? Zara asked. 3 years is standard, the lawyer replied, then raised a hand to forestall her protest. However, given the circumstances of abuse, which we can document through witness testimony, your cousin, Dr. Marshall, and Mr. Hawkins, we might persuade a judge to grant it sooner. It wasn't an ideal solution, but it offered hope. Zara threw herself into building a new life while she waited, helping Elizabeth with her charitable work, writing in the evenings, and exploring Denver with growing confidence. She purchased new clothes, practical but feminine, and let her hair begin to grow out from its severe cut. 3 weeks passed with no word from Mason. Zara tried not to worry, telling herself the journey was long and communication unreliable. Still, as the 4th week began, anxiety gnawed at her. Had something happened to him? Had Walter's men found him in Texas? On the 25th day since his departure, Zara was helping Elizabeth sort donations for the orphanage when there was a knock at the front door. Elizabeth's maid answered it, then hurried to the parlor. Miss Matthews, she said, barely containing her excitement. There's a gentleman caller for you. Zara's heart leapt. She smoothed her skirts and touched her hair self-consciously before following the maid to the entryway. There stood Mason, travel-worn and weary, but smiling that rare smile that transformed his entire face. You're back, Zara breathed, wanting to throw herself into his arms but mindful of the maid's presence. I told you I would be, Mason replied, his eyes drinking in the sight of her. May I speak with you privately? Elizabeth, who had followed Zara into the hall, intervened smoothly. The garden is lovely this time of day. Why don't you show Mr. Hawkins, Zara? I'll have refreshments sent out. Once they were alone among Elizabeth's roses, propriety was forgotten. Zara stepped into Mason's embrace, clinging to him as if he might disappear. I was beginning to fear the worst, she confessed against his chest. It took longer than expected, Mason explained, drawing back to look at her. There was trouble at the ranch. Blackburn's men had been watching it, and I had other business to attend to. Your cattle, the land. Sold all of it, Mason confirmed. For a fair price, thankfully. I'm not a wealthy man, but I have enough to start over. He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket. I also brought you this. He handed her a folded document. Puzzled, Zara opened it, then gasped as she read the contents. A divorce decree, she whispered, looking up at him in disbelief. How is this possible? It turns out Walter Blackburn had secrets of his own, Mason explained, satisfaction evident in his tone. When I returned to Texas, I did some investigating. Blackburn was already married when he wed you to a woman in St. Louis who is very much alive. Your marriage was never legal in the first place. Zara stared at the paper in her hands, emotions warring within her: relief, anger, vindication. I'm free, she murmured, the truth of it slowly sinking in. Truly free? Yes, Mason confirmed, taking her hands in his. Free to choose your own path, free to be Zara Matthews again. Free to love whom I choose, Zara added, meeting his gaze steadily. Mason's expression grew serious as he lowered himself to one knee before her, still holding her hands. Zara Matthews, I came back as I promised. Not just to bring you that paper, but to ask if you would consider building a new life with me. I love you, your courage, your strength, your gentle heart. I want to wake up beside you every morning and sleep beside you every night. I want to hear your stories and tell you mine. He took a deep breath. Will you marry me? Tears blurred Zara's vision, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. Yes, she answered without hesitation. Yes, Mason Hawkins, I will marry you. They were wed a month later in Elizabeth's garden, a simple ceremony with few guests but abundant love. Dr. Marshall gave the bride away, and Elizabeth served as witness. Zara wore a dress of pale blue to match the color of your toes when I found you, Mason had teased when she showed it to him. Their vows were personal and heartfelt, Mason promising to cherish her independence as much as her companionship, Zara pledging to stand beside him in all of life's storms. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared held all the promise of their future together. That future began in Denver, where Mason used his experience and education to secure a position with a law firm specializing in land disputes. His practical knowledge of ranching and property, combined with his legal background, made him valuable to clients throughout the growing territory. Zara, true to her promise, wrote their story, though with names and details changed to protect their privacy. To her surprise and delight, it was accepted by a Denver newspaper as a serial, launching her career as a writer of romantic adventures. They purchased a small house on the outskirts of the city, close enough for Mason's work but with enough land to satisfy his love of open spaces. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and red. Do your feet still hurt when it snows? Mason asked one such evening, a year after they had met, her stockinged feet resting in his lap as he massaged them gently. Sometimes, Zara admitted. But then I remember how you warmed them that first night, how careful you were with me when you had every reason to be suspicious of a half-frozen stranger. Not suspicious, Mason corrected. Intrigued. Even then, something told me you were going to change my life. Zara smiled, leaning forward to kiss him. For the better, I hope. For the better, Mason confirmed, pulling her closer, though I could have done without the gunfire and cross-country chase. Where would be the adventure in that? Zara teased. Besides, it makes for a better story. Man meets woman under ordinary circumstances doesn't quite capture readers' imaginations. No, Mason agreed, his voice growing serious. But man loves woman for the rest of their days makes for a perfect ending, don't you think? The perfect ending, Zara echoed, resting her head on his shoulder as the last light faded from the sky. Or perhaps, the perfect beginning. In the years that followed, their love deepened and their family grew. Their firstborn, a son they named James after Elizabeth's husband, arrived on a snowy night that brought back memories both terrifying and precious. 2 years later, a daughter joined them, with her mother's amber eyes and her father's quiet determination. Mason's law practice flourished, focusing increasingly on women's property rights, a cause inspired by Zara's experience, and supported by her influential writing on the subject. Together, they became advocates for changing the laws that treated wives as possessions, working tirelessly to ensure other women wouldn't suffer as Zara had. As for Walter Blackburn, they learned years later that he had lost most of his fortune in mining speculation and died in obscurity, his bigamy exposed and his reputation ruined. Zara felt no joy at the news, only a quiet sense of justice having been served. On their 10th anniversary, Mason surprised Zara with a gift, a pair of fine leather boots, custom-made to fit her perfectly. "For the next time you decide to run through the snow," he explained with a smile, "though I'd prefer you stay by my side." "Always," Zara promised, understanding the deeper meaning behind his gift. "I found my home when I found you, Mason Hawkins. Where you are is where I belong." That night, as snow began to fall outside their window, the first of the season, they stood together watching the white flakes illuminate the darkness. Zara's feet, long healed but still bearing faint scars from her desperate flight, were warm in Mason's hands as he held her close. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that night?" she asked softly. Mason shook his head. "No, because somehow I believe we were always meant to find each other. If not in that snowstorm, then somewhere else, some other time." Zara smiled, turning in his embrace to face him. "A writer would call that destiny. A cowboy would call it plain good luck," Mason countered, brushing a strand of hair from her face hair that had grown long again but that she now wore freely, sometimes braided, sometimes loose, always her choice. "Either way," Zara murmured, rising on tiptoe to kiss him, "I'm grateful for every step of that journey, painful as it was. It led me to you." Outside, the snow continued to fall. No longer an enemy to be feared, but a reminder of how their story began with bare feet in the snow, and a cowboy's gentle hands bringing warmth back to a frozen heart.